Right there, come here. There we go. What's up, guys? Welcome back. Glad you were here to join me. Today we're not talking about the Mavic Mini or the Osmo Action. Today we're talking about mirrorless cameras and some settings you can do to help make it easier for you if you're just getting started making vlogs. Okay, so let's just say you got the new Sony a6400 or really any camera similar to this, whether it be the Canon M50 or one of the Fuji offerings, and you had high hopes that you were going to be able to start vlogging. You got your camera out, you turned it on, you pointed at yourself, and you start videoing and talking to it, but when you get the footage home, it just doesn't look that good. So what I'm going to talk about today is some settings you can change to make it a little bit easier for you. Instead of being in fully automatic mode or fully manual mode, this is kind of a semi-automatic mode, and I think if you change a few of these settings, it might make things a little easier and make your footage look a little bit better. So let's go ahead and switch this camera and I'll talk about it now. Okay, first things first, let's get out of that automatic mode. We're going to use sort of a semi-automatic mode. So the first thing you need to do is go into your camera settings, and under your video settings or movie settings, depending on your camera, you want to switch your exposure mode to shutter priority mode. That's step one. So why do we switch to shutter priority? Well, without geeking out too much, let me explain quickly like how a camera gets its exposure. There's three parts to it, often called the exposure triangle. You've got shutter speed, you've got aperture, and you've got ISO. Those three settings on your camera determine the amount of light and the duration of time that light remains on the sensor, which gives you your image. When you're making a video or a movie, you're taking a series of photographs in a row that are then stitched together, and that's where it talks about 24, 30, 60 frames per second. You want your shutter speed to remain constant during the entire recording of that, so you have proper motion blur. That's where you'll often hear that 180-degree shutter rule, and 180 degree doesn't make a lot of sense, or oftentimes they'll say double your frame rate. The reason why it's 180 degrees, I know I said I wasn't going to geek out on this, but I just can't help myself sometimes. It's called 180 degrees because a lot of movie cameras or video cameras, they use shutter angle instead of shutter speed. So the ideal shutter angle is 180. That's why you get a shutter 180 degree rule is what it's usually called. So I'm not going to go into a long explanation about shutter speeds and motion blur. I think you could probably watch other videos to cover that. I've actually made one before. I'll put a link to it up here that kind of gets a little more in depth with these settings, but you want to double your frame rate with your shutter speed. So if you're shooting at 24 frames a second, it's 1/50th, 30 frames a second, 1/60th. We'll just leave it at that with shutter speed. So for the purposes of this video, I'm using my Sony a6400 with the 10-18 f4 lens by Sony. It would work just as easily with the kit lens. It just would have a little bit narrower field of view, but I haven't used this lens in a while and I wanted to try it out today. So by switching our camera to shutter priority mode, what we're doing is we're telling the camera, hey buddy, I'll take care of the shutter speed. I'm gonna take care of that part of the exposure triangle. I'm gonna let you handle the aperture and the ISO. That's why I call this sort of a semi-automatic mode. You're taking control of one of the three parts. And some would argue in video, probably the most important part is to have a proper shutter speed. Otherwise, everything's going to look like a mess. Now, while we're still turning over 2/3 of the exposure triangle to the camera, we can have some control over at least one of those features. What we can do is we can tell the camera, I want a minimum and maximum ISO. You can go into your settings and set your minimum and maximum ISO. That's going to vary from camera to camera depending on the low light performance that your camera has. That's another way, kind of like a little hack where you're still in control of now 2/3 of the exposure triangle. So that covers most of the exposure settings. I know I kind of glossed over aperture, and there's a reason why for that. I know most people will be using the kit lens or a lens like this. If you set in these semi-automatic settings, the camera is going to change the aperture based on the lighting conditions. It's going to go from as wide as it'll go. So if you have a lens like this is 4 is the widest aperture, all the way down to f22, which is like a pinhole. Briefly on apertures, the way that works is think of it like the pupil in your eye. When you're out in bright sun, it shrinks down really small and becomes like a pinhole. And when you're in the dark, your pupil opens up real big to let more light in. That's kind of how aperture works, very basically. Now I realize it's much more complex than that, but it changes your depth of field. And if you want to get into that whole blurry background stuff and everything that a lot of people like to see, you're going to have to start messing with the aperture. So for just starting out, I probably wouldn't even worry about the aperture. I would just leave it as is and let it kind of work out on its own. You're not going to get that creamy, blurry background that everybody loves so much, but that'll come later when you want to go into full manual mode. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is white balance. White balance is one of those things that can really make your footage look absolutely awful. And I'll tell you why. It's because, you know, it's basically your camera's interpretation. I'm near an airport over here. There's some low-flying planes going by. Don't they know I'm trying to record a video and they're messing with my audio? Don't they know I'm so important? Anyways, back to white balance. White balance is one of those things that's still gives me a fit every now and then. I like to leave it on automatic white balance, but the caveat I have with that is if you're gonna use automatic white balance, turn on your camera, kind of get where you're at, and at least for the A6400, and this goes for most cameras, give it a second for the camera to like figure out the colors and adjust the white balance. Then you can go ahead and hit record and start going. I mean, the other option with white balance, you can always just set it yourself and lock it off through a custom white balance setting or the Kelvin scale, which that's a whole another thing. I'm not even gonna get into that in this video. The problem I have when I do that is it's a pain in the butt. You gotta do it every time you change locations. And if you're the kind of person like me that likes to go from place to place and film different scenes, it's just time consuming to have to set your white balance every time. The auto white balance for me works pretty good. And the next thing to choose is picture profiles. Most of the cameras come with a lot of different picture profiles in them. That was one of the things that attracted me to the Sony a6400. It had a variety of what's called flat picture profiles, which in theory give you a little bit more dynamic range. I'd say if you're just starting out and you're not really excited about learning how to color grade, just use the standard or neutral picture profile in your camera. Every camera's got one, they're called different things, but I would say stick with that in the beginning. And you're probably gonna be pretty happy with those results and not have to really do anything as far as color grading after the fact. As long as you do what I said and remember to give that white balance a second to stabilize. Exposure. All right, so we've covered exposure, we've covered picture profiles, white balance. The last key part of this is to talk about sound. Now, for me today, I'm using the Rode Wireless Go, which is about a $200 setup here. It's probably the best $200 I've spent since I've gone down this whole rabbit hole of YouTube. I just feel like it gives me the most freedom. I can be a little bit further away from the camera. I don't feel like I'm tethered or I have to worry about, am I getting enough sound when I use a shotgun mic? However, shotgun mics work really good. That was what I started with. I started with the Movo VXR10. It was a simple little shotgun mic, attaches to your camera, worked great for me, and I got pretty good audio. I just went to this because I wanted a little bit more freedom to try some more creative stuff. With the Sony a6400, I'm actually pretty happy with the audio that I get right out of the camera. So if you pick up this camera in particular, the a6400, the kit lens, the onboard mics, they're really not that bad. I would say you could have a pretty good setup with that. So if you invest in this camera, you use these settings that I told you, get you a little tripod, you really don't need much more. You can start making videos right away. Also, leave me a comment down below if you know what that means. I never played softball or baseball. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found something useful in it. If you did, maybe consider subscribing to my channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Either way, thanks for joining me on this quick little video, and I hope to see you again in the future. Bye.